Thank you, Rachel, and thank you for sticking with us. I'm shocked and horrified by that story, without belittling it, it might be useful to keep in front and centre of what we're saying today, because some of the things that we say might sound on the face of it a bit harsh, but this will actually put what we have to say into context. So today we're going to look at four parts. The first is, why do we need to last the distance? Now, we've used the word lasting the distance because, you know, we've all done a little bit of advocacy in our day, but this is going to be a long-term thing, and a little bit isn't going to be enough. So why do we need to last the distance will be Jeremy's task. Then he'll talk about what does it mean for you as a family. And then I'll be talking about what helps to last the distance. So, you know, what are some just practical strategies around that? And then what did we do? So I always think it's useful to hear about someone who's perhaps a bit ahead of you and what mistakes and good things we did. We certainly made lots of mistakes. So I'll let Jeremy get going.
All right, well, thank you, Marg and Rachel, and welcome everybody. And again, sorry for the technical hiccups. It seems sort of something that we just have to deal with sometimes. So the first thing I want to do is to talk about the reality of devaluation. So as I'm sure you all appreciate, there are many people in our society, wherever we are, who are devalued, and amongst those are people with disability, and children with disability get a double whammy because children are usually devalued anyway. So we're talking about a devalued group. And the reality of that is that people with disability are seen as lesser and inferior than others. You know, you'll often hear people talking about people with disability and using imagery about people with disability as if they are lesser beings in some sense. We all know that people with disability are also the objects of charity. So for many, many years, I know in your country and in ours and all over the world, people are seen as the objects of charity. Charitable organisations are set up to raise money. There are events that are used to raise money. We have one that actually might have just about finished here, a run along the riverside where we live that's raising money for people with multiple sclerosis. Now many people would see that as a worthwhile cause, but nevertheless, it is a charity. You know, the people with multiple sclerosis are seen as objects of the charity that the people who participate in that and raise money for that organisation, you know, will be doing. So that for all the best intentions in the world, people with disability are often seen this way. People with disability are also seen as burdens to others, and unfortunately, many parents and family members of people with disability can fall into this trap too. You know, I've worked with families a lot, and it's been a very common response when we're talking about, for example, planning for the future, as we did in the last seminar, that parents, or perhaps the key, if you like, person in the family will often say, well, I don't want that other family member, whether they're siblings, other children, I don't want them to be burdened. I want them to get on with their lives. So again, a very understandable response, but people with disability are often seen as burdens. they're also often seen as having futile lives. We have a very high profile now reporter on our national national broadcasting organisation, the ABC. She does a lot of television work, and she's profoundly blind. She has a profound visual impairment. And recently she did a piece on her own experience, where she was travelling on public transport, and a man came up to her and started asking her about her sight or lack of sight, and then within about 2 minutes said, you know, if I were you, I think I'd kill myself. He obviously meant that he thought that she must be going through a really difficult time living without sight. But what he was saying to her is that your life, in my view, is pretty well futile. And if I had to experience that, I would kill myself. People are seen as so profoundly different that they need special services. So we have special schools, we have special sporting organisations, we have the Special Olympics, everything, or so many things are seen as special because people with disability are seen as so different, so profoundly different, that they can't be supported to participate in ordinary, everyday, generic service responses or sporting organisations and so forth, schools. No, they need something special. So all these are examples of the reality of how people with disability are devalued. And at the end of the day, people are seen as a tragic mistake, you know, and the way that certainly in our country, selective abortion is practiced is an example of this, that parents are encouraged to try to determine before even a baby is born whether they're going to have a significant disability, and if so, they're given the option to terminate a pregnancy because it's just a mistake. Shouldn't happen. They're not normal, they're not ordinary, and of course they will be a burden and their lives will be futile and so forth. So all of those things, and there are many others we don't really have time to discuss, show us that people with disability have to face the reality of devaluation. They also have to deal with the impact of their impairment. So many people with disability can't communicate in typical ways. People who are deaf use sign language. That's in fact their primary language, and if they live in an English-speaking country, English is actually their second language. So they in fact have a very good way of communicating, and until very recently it was very difficult for them to communicate at all without interpreters, or to read, you know, to participate in lots of activities. We'll see these days that's improved a lot, and we'll have deaf interpreters at news conferences and captions on television and so forth. But for many people, they don't even have that. They might communicate through what's called facilitated communication, or some other way of using someone else to assist them to communicate. Many people with disability may lack insight, so they're not able to understand that they're in fact being mistreated. And this, of course, leads them to be very vulnerable. Many are physically restricted. People with physical disabilities are physically restricted and dependent on others. One of my older sisters was born with a very significant physical disability, and when she was living by herself in her own home unit, she had support workers that assisted her to do practically everything in her daily life, and that included managing her money. And at one point she used a debit card and to go and take money out of a machine. She couldn't physically do it, so she had to ask one of her support workers to do that. But she went with her, thinking that would be safeguard enough. But one particular support worker was very clever at standing between my sister and the machine and taking out, you know, twice as much money as my sister asked, and and slipping some of it into her blouse or whatever. And we discovered over a period of time that she had about $2,000 stolen from her. So we changed that system of her managing her money. But she was someone who was well able to make decisions and control her expenditure and so forth, but she couldn't physically access an automatic teller machine or so on, so without assistance. We also have the impact of social context. So we have lower standards of service or treatment. We have entrenched discrimination. We have people growing to be accustomed to lesser treatment. And that's not only people with disability, but it can be the people closest to them, such as family members. We get so used to people being treated at a lower standard that we become accustomed to it. People's rights are often ignored. The example that Rachel gave us, in many ways, the little that I understood of it, it's a prime example of people's rights being ignored. And access to rights are often restricted. So people don't have the wherewithal to gain access to the processes that the rest of us might find reasonably straightforward, either because of their social isolation, and of course, their lack of financial wherewithal. Many people with disability in our country live on or below the poverty line. And so it's very difficult for them to pay for any support that they might need in the legal system unless they can get that support through some sort of agency, a legal aid agency. So the impact of the social context also has a big impact on the reality of people's lives. And when you have people who are vulnerable like this, unfortunately, there are people in our societies who exploit those vulnerabilities. So we also have the impact of services which can't meet everyone's needs. Services often take a life of their own. So the interests of staff, of unions, of funders, etc., take precedence over the interests of the people they serve. People can even become captives of care. So they become so isolated and dependent that they literally cannot get out to get the support or the advocacy supports and so forth that they might need. And again, service life becomes a yardstick for reasonable treatment. So we become accustomed to a low level of service, and then that over time is seen as the standard rather than what would be acceptable service provision in the society as a whole. So why do people need advocacy? Well, they can't rely on their rights being upheld. When rights are non-existent or ignored, something more is needed, and that something more is advocacy. So for all those reasons that I've outlined, the reality of people's lives, they need something more than simply having a nice framework of rights, even if it's legislated in domestic legislation. There is still a need to do something more than just be able to point to a piece of paper with the rights spelled out, and that is advocacy. So the normal everyday term advocacy is known as pleading in support of. And an advocate is someone who pleads or intercedes or speaks for another. And that's a definition out of the Oxford Dictionary, but it's standard across all English language dictionaries that I've seen. It's a very common everyday notion of advocacy. What I'm going to talk about now is what's known as social advocacy, and it was first developed by Professor Wolfensberger in the United States. Now, it's a long definition, and we'll go through in detail after I go through this definition as a whole. So advocacy is seen as speaking and acting and writing with minimal conflict of interest. That's very important. On behalf of the sincerely perceived interests of a disadvantaged person or group, to promote, protect and defend their welfare and justice, by being on their side and no one else's, by being primarily concerned with the individual's fundamental needs, and in a way that remains loyal and accountable to them, and the advocacy is pursued in a way that's emphatic and vigorous. And finally, this speaking up and standing up for people is done in a way that's likely to be costly, or in fact is costly, to the advocate or the advocacy group. So that's a very, very long and quite complex definition. So what we'll now do is by looking at how we might apply that definition, we'll pick up those various aspects. So the first one is always to be on the side of the family member with disability. Now you might think, well, that's pretty obvious, but it is important to remember, because many people against whom you might be carrying out advocacy can be very quick to point out that, well, if you pursue your family members' interests, if you pursue your claim for a different service, a better service, more funding, etc., then something will have to be taken away from someone else. It's a very, very standard response. And it's easy for people to feel, oh, well, I better back off then. But the reality is you have to be on the side of your family member. And if a service is saying, if we give you what you're asking for, we'll have to take that away from someone else that we're providing services to, your response should be, well, that's not my issue. That's your issue. It's your issue is to determine what you're going to do in providing a decent service to everybody that you serve. What I'm doing here is advocating for my family member. So being on the side of the family member is very, very important. It's also important to focus on people's major needs. So you can see already how this definition of advocacy differs from this very simple form of advocacy, speaking up or pleading a cause. Here, the definition asks us to make sure we're focusing on what's really important. So, for example, if we're interested in an inclusive life for people with disability, which I assume all of you are, then instead of advocating for a better segregated or special service, such as a group home, we should be advocating for an inclusive service or inclusive response, someone to have a home of their own. So we focus on what's really critical and important, what people's major needs are. The next aspect of this sort of advocacy is to ensure that you stick by your family member over the long term. Now, again, I'm sure all of you are saying, well, why wouldn't we? And of course, absolutely. But I know that Margaret and I found that when we were really stuck, we didn't know where to go. We didn't know what to do next. We were exhausted. This was part of the definition that we used to fall back on and say, well, look, at the very least, what we can do for Mina right now is stick by her and make a commitment to ourselves and to her that we'll be there over the long term. And down the track, we'll have more energy, we'll work out what we're going to do. The fact that we can't do it now doesn't mean that we give up and walk away. We stick by people. Very, very importantly, we have to act with a minimal conflict of interest. Now, it says minimal because it's impossible to avoid conflict of interest. You have interests that are quite legitimate and, in fact, that you cannot escape from. So, for example, you have limited time, we all do. You have limited energies, we all do. You might have limited financial resources, most of us do. But the idea here is to not say, I have to act without any conflict of interest, meaning that I have to somehow or other ignore that my interest for sleep and revitalizing my energy, finding more time is something I don't have to take into account. Those things will always get in the way. What we have to do is try to minimize the conflicts of interest in the advocacy we do. And we also have to be very vigorous in our actions. So again, we don't just, speak in whispers. We don't stand back and say something that we know is not really going to make any difference. We have to be vigorous. We have to make it clear what we want. We have to make it clear to everybody else that what we're doing is important enough for us and for our family member that we're really going to be we're not going away. We're going to be vigorous in the advocacy that we carry out. We also have to accept that the advocacy will come at a cost. And this is simply a reality. And if your advocacy doesn't come at much of a cost, then you need to question whether you are going far enough in the advocacy that you're carrying out. For all of you who are contemplating doing something about the situation that Rachel outlined briefly at the beginning, one of the things you will be thinking of, well, if I put my hand up and start objecting to this, will it cost me? Will I lose whatever funding I have? Will my son or daughter, family member suffer in some way because I'm speaking up? So we always have to be very careful in our advocacy to try to remember that not to do things if we can, that we can foresee might have a very negative outcome on our family member, but nevertheless, real, strong, vigorous advocacy, advocating for someone's best, for the fundamental needs of our family member will inevitably come at a cost. And the sooner that we can accept that and acknowledge that, the sooner we can simply work out how we're going to deal with that, how we're going to approach that and move ahead. Finally, this definition says that we need to remember the needs of others who may have a greater need than us, or our family members, sorry. So this sometimes is a bit difficult to get our heads around, and it's not clear always what we should do. But you might be advocating, let's say you're a parent and you have a school-age child, you're advocating to have your child get a better deal at your school, and you come across examples of other children at the school who don't even have an advocate like you to advocate for them. And you can see that they're getting an even worse deal than your son or daughter or family member. So it's important to remember that there are, as you go forward in your advocacy, you will come across situations like this, and this part of the definition invites you to work out what you might do about that, how you may respond to that. You may, for example, point out to the school that this child is getting a really raw deal. Doesn't mean you advocate for them in the same way that you do for your family member. You may not really advocate for them at all, but you might try to find someone else who could, and at the very least make their needs known to the powers that be in the school or in the service system or circumstances where you're advocating. So that, excuse me, that wraps up my my section. Excuse me. Coughing fit came just at the right time because I'm going to hand over to Marg. And this little cartoon's just by way of a break. And it's basically says, Mr. McDonald, some of us would like to speak up to the noise level on your farm. So that may not be seen as a really fundamental issue, but I can tell you for some people, if you live with a lot of noise around you, it can be right up there. I'll hand over to Mark.
Okay. So moving along. So I'm going to talk a bit more practically. Jeremy's very good on this theory, and he's also an extremely good advocate, might I say. But my job is to give some practical frame around this. So I think the first is accepting that it's a marathon that you're on. It's once you've accepted it, it's certainly easier, I think. You know, as I think Gloria Steinem said, you know, once when Twitter said, you know, the truth, then there's a freedom in that. So this is a bit naff, but I think it's really important. It is that you need to keep well, keep fit, and keep rested. And this is part of the conflict of interest, in just understanding that if you run yourself ragged and then you're no use to anyone. So in understanding that this is a marathon, you need to develop a lifestyle where you will remain fit and well and at least get enough sleep. I think it's really, well, we both know this, that people can take your energy, and I got very ruthless about this. So I kept negative people away. I sidelined them, and I kept positive, hopeful people close. So if I felt drained by somebody who, for whatever reason, wanted more from me than I could give, I really worked to keep them at a distance. I also, and this is quite relevant, really relevant for the example that Rachel gave, is about protecting your family's privacy and well-being. Services and professionals often step over the line and ask for more information than they need to have. And I think this is, you can say, is this relevant? Do you need to know this? You know, like, do you have other children? What was the birth like? You know, that sort of, you know, is this relevant? Do you need to know this? Because I'm actually uncomfortable about telling you all these things. So you have a role in saying, no, I don't think I need to tell you that. So the other thing about this is that in advocacy, which this wasn't an issue in our time, but you know, social media can really start crashing in here. And I think this is a moment to just put out a word of warning about using social media, putting up photos unnecessarily, and also trying to resolve arguments or issues by social media. It never works. There is a whole body of understanding now around the limitations of social media and how it can intrude into your life and your privacy. This is a funny term, and I realise I most probably need to explain it, but it's about defending your family business. There are some things that families do that no one else should do, and that is plan your own life, have your own rituals and culture and celebrations, and do what your family idiosyncratically does. That's your family business. And that's got nothing to do with what services are about or what professionals think you should do. but they often do give advice on how you should run your family. Now, I will talk about advice later, but I think you can say, just have in your mind, what is family business? What is the business of your family? And then what is the business of the service? And don't let them get mixed up. The services can very quickly, and professionals can quickly intrude into that area as well. And the third here is about working in right relationship. Now, I that's a sort of a trendy term, but I think there's a couple of things in that. One is always be courteous, even if you want to punch someone out. Always tell the truth, and never, always tell the truth, always be courteous, and keep going and be tenacious. So they're the three things that are really important in right relationships. So that's a level of assertiveness, telling the truth. Your story is always good enough, and being courteous and not getting into name calling. And then you're working in right relationship. Now, I've sent a single handout to Rachel, which I'm sure she can send to everyone, which is about the natural authority of families by Michael Kendrick. He wrote it many, many years ago, and I used to have it on my fridge because it was so affirming. Now, I'm just taking a couple of points out of this. It's good to have under your belt that you know that generally people in our Western culture recognise the importance of families. So be proud and loud about the fact that you are a strong family. Know and that you know your family, the family member, the best and for the longest. There is no one else. It's very unlikely there's anyone else that knows more about your family member or has more history than you have. The next is that it's understood generally that you care the most. And in fact, you most probably do. So people come and say they're carers or there's a caring organisation. In Australia, the average turnover is 18 months of those caring people. Sorry, that's not who cares the most. It is those in the family that are there in the long term that care the most. You also have the biggest stake in the outcomes. So some service or somebody might want you to do something that in your bones doesn't feel right. It's always important to think and to say, listen, if this doesn't work, who's going to pick up the pieces here? You know, we have a stake in the outcome of this. So you've got to really convince me that what you're saying is a good thing to do, or that you're not going to damage our family member in any way. And that you're best positioned to see things holistically. So you know the family culture, you know the person's history, you know how the siblings are, you know what grandpa thinks, you know everything that happened to the child, now adult perhaps, and it's in a way that no one else does. So these are all extremely important things, and they give you a natural authority to advocate strongly. You also have independence and purity of motive. Now, Jeremy will say you can never have complete independence or complete purity of motive, but you have a hell of a lot, and you've most probably got the least conflict of interest of anyone around. So so then the next is about taking charge where you can. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be in charge of everything, but you identify what you can take charge of, and you take that fulsomely. So what we found was really important is that you take every opportunity to learn. There'll be a point where you're exhausted and tired and you can't take on anything more, but there will be a moment when you will realize that you've got to learn everything you can so that you're as informed as possible, whether it's about your child's disability or about the service or what's happening else in the world. Take every opportunity to learn, and it's so much easier to do this now with the internet and the communications that we have. And also, don't be, a wallflower here. Develop the skills that you need. If you need to be a bit more assertive, if you find all this terrifying, go to assertiveness classes. Learn the language of assertiveness. Learn to speak publicly. Learn to drive a car if you need to. Learn the computer skills you need. Whatever it is that is holding you back in your advocacy, get those skills and those practices up to speed. You can do anything. You can do all of those things. Other is to be present and observant. So, we might be so busy rushing around, we actually don't see what is happening. So make sure that you do see what's happening for your family member. Drop in to the school, do impromptu visits, all those things. Be present so they know you're around and that you're not a pushover. Be ready for things to go wrong. So, when someone says, oh, it's all okay, trust us, it's all fine. No, always have some safeguards up your sleeve and keep thinking, all right, if this doesn't go right, what can I do about it? So that's about solving those problems quickly before they get out of hand. So be ready to problem solve as quickly as possible. We've already talked to you about visioning and planning ad nauseum, but I do revisit this by saying it becomes a way of thinking. So you're ahead of the game, you're thinking and planning and I guess double guessing what might go wrong or what you can do about it. By being passive and just trusting people without understanding really who they are is a very risky strategy to take. So part of that is about being clear about your vision of what a good life is. So you can pick up within a whiff when something isn't going well. I was so good at this, it used to happen ahead of me before I'd even put words to it. And I started to feel agitated or cranky, I had to go away and think, why am I agitated? It's because something wasn't going right that I could sense. Plan. Keep thinking, what can I do next? What can I do next? But also be ready for that spontaneous opportunity because, sometimes they do come. And if you're so intent on planning and you don't look sideways, you might miss a really good opportunity. And you would take that opportunity and see it because you have been planning and that opportunity works for you and works for your family member. And be open to challenge by people you trust. Now, there's two parts to that. It's being open to be challenged, because you don't know everything and you're on a big learning curve. But there are people I only took advice from people I trusted, that I thought were really on my side and who knew me well. So that's very important. That was very important to me, that I would be challenged quite happily as long as I trusted that person. And repeat, this is a lifestyle. This is a way of thinking. So the last section here is what did we do personally to last the distance? Now, I feel a little bit of a sham here because our darling daughter died after 30 years, and some of our dearest friends are soldiering on. And so many of their lessons in life I'm reflecting on now. So the first is that the plan and the vision for Mina made us clear and strong. There is no doubt about it. If we had not had that vision, developed that vision for her when she was 10 years old, we would have been not had the strength of purpose that we had for the next 20 years. And that, you know, there were often, we didn't know what was going to be the next stage, but we did trust in the planning process. We trusted that, you know, if we sat down and thought it through, went back to the vision and worked it out in a logical way, it would show us the way, what the next step would be. So even if it was a small step, we knew it was in the right direction. Sharing and this is lovely. This was a lovely surprise for us, that sharing a positive vision and a plan attracted good people into our lives. The wishy-washy people started to fade away. The people that didn't want to be part of this journey didn't turn up anymore. And the people who did turned up, and they were good people. They were strong folk, and they were folk that were willing to back us. We could decide on the right path, not the easy path. So if you have this framework, if you're thinking of what is a good life and what is your vision for that good life and what's your plan, then it's easier to pick the right path rather than the easy path. People will offer you easy outs, like there's a place in this group home you could go to, you know, and then it'll all be fixed for you. No, that's not the vision. That's not the plan. It's going to be harder to find a home for Mina. It's going to be harder to find the supports for her so she can live her own life. But that's the right path. That's the right path. So, and I am also, at the risk of being repetitive, our circle of support made us strong. There is no doubt we could not have done this on our own. We would have been, you know, a very sad and pathetic couple if we had not had the support of others. All this was too big for the two of us. We needed to bring other people in. So, and it was our best decision to invite people in. Scary, but it was no doubt the best decision we made. The work of building a circle, building the vision and the plan is countercultural, absolutely. Most families we knew prior to Mina just sort of, you know, wandered through life very happily without a worry or a big worry in their lives. What we were doing in stopping, thinking, calling other people in to help us was countercultural. No one else was doing this. So, once we'd accepted that, that was fine. Also, it was hard work. It was good work, but it was hard work, and it was very powerful. It was very powerful work. We were able to do things that I don't think we would ever have been able to do on our own. And again, as I said in the webinar previous to this, is that we had the circle for 20 years, and people came and went. Some people came, went, and came back again, and older people left and young people came in. So it was a moving feast of people, which was only natural as everyone has changing lives, but the circle remained constant. And it became very clear that this was the safeguard for Mina, and also for our daughter and our other daughter and son's future. I saw as my children grew up that they saw the circle as their tribe, as their the people that would be with them after we had gone, who would work with them to build a good life for Mina, keep building a good life for Mina. So we can't tell you how you do your personal advocacy. I think Jeremy's points are absolutely critical. You know, to understand what advocacy is going to mean for you. There were very significant costs for us. There's no doubt, but these are the things that kept us strong. And another thing that did keep us connected and informed was a broader involvement. Now, this might seem to cut across what Jeremy was saying about not having a conflict of interest or keeping your conflict of interest minimal. So take some thought. You know, if you speak out, you'll be whipped onto every committee that stands. You need to be choosy about your broader involvement, but some broader involvement will feed into you, into your essential advocacy for your family member, and will keep you connected and keep you informed on what is happening around the world and in your area. So it's about being choosy about your broader involvement, but it does stop you being isolated, and it does keep you very informed. So we learnt lots from other families and other change agents. That was a huge value in our lives. We took breaks, and we knew that the disability issues would always wait for us. They weren't going to go off and go somewhere else. So we did take breaks. We had our regular holidays, and if we were getting cranky and tired, we just take a weekend off and kick back. We also searched out for the stick with it people who spoke to our experience. So they were wonderful. Not many people are around, but those people will give you such valuable information and valuable advice just when you need it. So search them out and find them. We're here in Brisbane. Just send us a text or FaceTime us. We could talk to you about things, you know, quite easily these days. Safeguarding the future gave us a peace of mind. So as I finish up here, we realised that trust takes time to build. We invested in people and not in buildings and services. We put our time in good people, and we documented our information and plans. So we've done that one before. So having a peace of mind that you've done those things helps you with your advocacy as well. So, and we began to step back for the next generation. So again, we're coming back to the last webinar, but this is all helpful in keeping you strong and lasting the distance. So I'm finishing off here with a picture of Mina, who I do wonder whether she knew about all the work we did. She was a good time gal, and I think our greatest joy was that she just expected life to be good. Yeah, so thank you. It's exactly